Okay, Matt, thanks so much for joining. Let's get into it. How did you end up working and making wine?
Very lucky decision at a young age, mate. A lot of people I kind of met early on had kind of discovered wine later in life or had been brought in through, the family owning a vineyard. But for me, it was a little different. Grew up in a house full of food and wine and had a lucky work experience placement at a vineyard when I was 16 and just loved it. Loved the vineyard work, loved hanging out in a winery full of cool equipment and gear. And then obviously wine itself, the whole thing of craft and making and, it was just really drawn in from a very young age. So, yeah.
Nice. And then why the Hunter? Well, how did you come to settle in the Hunter Valley?
The Hunter early on was simply around proximity that I'd kind of grown up in Sydney and close by in later years. And the family had often visited the Hunter Valley and kind of, in those formative years had cut my teeth on the great wines from brands like Tyrrell's and McWilliams Mount Pleasant and Lindemans back in its day. And considering it was only a couple of hours up the road, that's kind of where I first, decided to give it a go. And I just loved, how unique this area was, that it was, in Australia, we love the underdog, right? We're always banging on about the underdog. And the Hunter Valley is very much like that in that we're a long way north for a wine growing area in Australia. And we're quite influenced by the coast. We're quite maritime in that way. So there's a lot of pressure here in the Hunter, climate wise. But yet, over the years that we've, I guess, been working with varieties like Shiraz and more so Semillon, we've been able to craft these really, really unique wines that, deliver year in and year out, despite kind of what the weather throws at us. And I was really drawn by that, this idea that you could create these stunning wines in an area that maybe shouldn't even be, but it is,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So touching on those grape varieties and Semillon being, I mean, Hunter Valley Semillon is pretty much one of the, as you say, one of the most unique styles of wines worldwide. And
Yep.
what do you think the longevity of Hunter Valley Semillon and the way that it has nestled itself into this icon Australian style? What role do you think that therefore Hunter plays in the Australian domestic market as well as the world stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think internationally, there's probably three wines in Australia that are regarded as totally unique to us, and that is, sparkling Shiraz, Rutherglen Muscat, fortified Muscat, and Hunter Valley Semillon. I mean, otherwise you can find great Chardonnay, Riesling, Shiraz, Pinot all over the world, obviously, particularly in France. But yeah, Hunter Semillon, totally unique. And I think in the winescape, for me, the closest, I've kind of come across over the years is probably like Shannon's out of Vouvray. That you get these wines that, particularly at the drier end of their spectrum, that can be very closed when they're young and a little bit hard to understand. And then, over many years in the bottle, and we're talking, for Hunter Semillon, 20, 30 years isn't unheard of. And this kind of really backwards, understated style metamorphoses into this, really complex, toasty, really endearing wine. And yeah, in that way, it's totally unique in the world of wine. And, having, this area been turning out that style of wine for, well over 100 years, there's really good pedigree here, both domestically and internationally for that style.
Yeah, so with the world of wine and perhaps the world looking for more instant gratification. I mean, even Bordeaux first growths are more readily drinkable now than they would have been ever before. How have you sort of found that and had to combat that need for wines that are ready immediately rather than something that needs to have 30, 40 years in bottle before developing nuances?
Absolutely, mate. And, I even look in my own cellar and how many 30 to 40-year-old bottles of wine are there in there? Not many. I'm going to say that, So yeah, you've got to keep it real in that way, and the numbers kind of back that up. The vast majority of wine, like well over 90%, is kind of drunk within a couple of days or 24
couple of hours, probably.
So,
yeah,
exactly. So yeah, we take that on board. I mean, as a region, the style has evolved a lot over the last 10 to 15 years, and what we now describe as classic Hunter Semillon in the modern era is very different to classic Hunter Semillon, beyond 15 years back. So picking slightly later, keeping an eye on acidity levels, not making these ultra austere wines. And obviously, a general movement away from, relying on sulfur dioxide, particularly in excessive quantities to really lend itself to that long-term aging, backing that off. There's a whole range of things that we're kind of bringing in, which is delivering us a style that, you can approach now, but also will have the potential to age for quite some time. For my brand, in Semillons, we make 6 or 7 different styles a year, from that, really ultra clean, light, almost backwards wine, from really, terroirs with pedigree out here on sandy soils, et cetera, to kind of chase that really age-worthy style. Then all the way through to wines like the Wild Semillon, which we've had a lot of success with in the UK. And with this one, we're fermenting on skins, we're fermenting using naturally occurring yeast, we're driving texture and complexity, and interest beyond the outright potential to kind of make a wine that's going to age, indefinitely. So absolutely, there's a real acknowledgement of that requirement. So.
And how did the old guard take because there's some of the most established families in the Australian wine world based in Hunter. How did they take to fermenting on skins, wild ferment, not stainless steel, sulfur? How was that received at first?
I think, our first vintage with the Wild Semillon was in 2011. And back then in Australia, there wasn't a huge amount of what, the natural wine movement, the orange wine movement happening. It was kind of before a lot of that. So what we were doing, particularly in the Hunter, as you mentioned, is I guess, prides itself on the sense of history and style that we have here, by Australian standards. We're, one of the oldest areas in the country, and certainly home to some of the oldest vineyards. So there was certainly some recognition that we'd broken a few rules and, push the envelope potentially further than others would. In fact, not potentially, certainly. But, people talk about how anecdotally, how other producers are doing, how their wines are going. And I think quite quickly, some of the older guard started to recognize that there was real market for a wine like this. And, there's chat about where you're buying fruit from, how much you're buying, and, it's obviously going somewhere. And that Semillon, the Wild Semillon, very quickly started to account for over 25% of our production. And people, I guess, in that way, if you were following our brand, you were probably a little bit more likely to try something like that yourself. So you are seeing a much greater, like fast forward now, basically 10 years, most producers will have a white fermented on skins. If not Semillon, it'll be another local white. Certainly more experimentation with indigenous yeast, even a little bit of oak work, but also, and for European kind of viewers of this or followers of wine, the use of, or the fact that you embrace the idea of residual sweetness, balancing acidity, etc., has been for a long time in Australia, a real no-go area. That sweet wines were considered, or wines with any level of detectable sweetness were considered very commercial and kind of, You've
only got Moscato, really, haven't you? That's pretty much
exactly. Exactly. I mean, we've got a long history of some very successful, overtly sweet wines. I mean, we probably exported quite a bit to you guys as well back in the day. So I think globally, there's a bit of a trend in that way. But now the consumer and the winemaker is kind of unified in that desire to explore this idea that you can have slightly off dry whites or fully off dry whites, semi-sweet whites, providing there's checks and balances in terms of acidity and style. So, yeah.
No, I mean, we've been working on it for years with German Riesling and Cabernet
Yep.
being that hugely austere, and the fact that it takes them 6 to 8 weeks to pick their whole harvest anyway. They've got to pick something early, and therefore it's got huge acidity. So therefore, balancing out with the sugar is an absolute must. Otherwise, you'll end up with just this stripper acid bomb. And so coming on to reds, I guess Shiraz is still, with that short growing season, quite a tricky variety to grow in Hunter. Is that becoming more difficult as sort of climate changes, or perhaps not?
It's a good question. I think, for us with Shiraz, we're fortunate to work across 3 areas in basically the New South Wales region or state, in the Hunter Valley, Canberra, which is, it is its own state, but it's pretty well the same area, and Hilltops, which is down near Canberra. So we get quite a broad geographical spread, and it's really interesting, having worked with those areas between 15 and 20 years now, to see how much things are changing. The Hunter Valley, we've just come off a run of, really quite extreme hot and dry years. Now, those years for reds in particular have delivered some stunning wines. I mean, the little trilogy of 17, 18, and 19, stunning. But then the conclusion of such a run of hot, dry years was a disastrous bushfire season. I mean, no rainfall for kind of 5 years or so, and horrendous winds and temperatures. And, that's kind of a timely reminder that, such a run of, if we say, oh yeah, it's fabulous because it's much drier now than it may have been in the past, there's a flip side to that, and not just that, but diminishing yields to a point where, you're getting nothing from a vineyard, or, your fruit is ripening too quickly.
Yeah, you've got your concentration, but there's no fruit.
yeah. And having said that, this year, and we've struck a La Nina, so the fortunes have tipped the other way here, and we've had torrential rain up north, and it's basically made its way here. So we're going to see what happens now. But, it's a bit of a seesaw effect. But overall, it's getting hotter. The season's getting more compressed. But in the Hunter, that's working because it's slightly drier. Okay. In Canberra, in the Hilltops, that dryness is more of a concern because the overall trend in areas like that, in anywhere in inland Australia, is desertification. So increasing aridity. And you don't need tremendous temperature increases in those areas to have massive drying effects, because their overall rainfall is much lower than areas like the Hunter. And not just rainfall, but also humidity. I mean, the Hunter's a very humid area. It's, it's almost subtropical. So, totally. Really interesting to kind of feel our way through that. And the idea that we're spreading our risk across 3 areas is working for us now. Having said that, for every year that we don't pick in a certain area, growers down there are hurting really badly. So, our adaptations around things like water management practices, canopy management, shielding western sides of the canopy, letting it go down a bit. Foliar application of these kind of very kind of organic, they're basically like a sunscreen application you can put out there. And that works to really reflect a lot of the heat and avoid the big problem with reds, because they hang out there a little longer, is the risk for dehydration and raisoning of the fruit.
Alcohol.
Exactly. And also loss of identity. And I think that is the biggest risk, particularly in those cooler areas, that, you'll get a crop off every year, but it might be 14 Beaumet, and, you get like a dry red rather than a distinct, terroir specific Shiraz to that area. That's to me the greatest risk at the moment.
You don't want to turn into the Barossa, do you? Well, it's where you're going with it.
In many ways, that's no bad thing. But in what happens in reality, and I used to hang on that kind of stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, I'd look at the climate data and expectations and already where we're at. Like most of these areas, we've already increased by a degree or more. Australia is the canary in the coal mine. The irony of that, we're shipping all the coal out, and we're the ones heating up most. So, you know, there's already been a lot of change. And I used to hang on data like, oh, you know, we'll just be like the Barossa, we'll just be like this. And that's all well and good to kind of say and think that, but it doesn't work that way because the prevailing weather patterns are so different, and you know, they just don't transfer with temperature.
And talking of growers hurting, I mean, it's the price that, because of the cropping, as you're saying, is so low, price required per ton is essentially, it must be increasing quite dramatically.
Yeah.
And therefore the temptation for growers to look to other arable crops or pastoral crops, is that a big problem in the hunter as well at the moment?
I mean, while demand is strong, while the prices are up, the growers will, you know, keep that kind of climbing up. I think what happens with China now will be very interesting
Sure.
in the winemaker grower relationship.
Yeah.
Probably not hugely so in the hunter because most of us are at the smaller scale of things.
Yeah.
But certainly in South Australia, I think that's going to have some big flow-ons there. And without a very lucrative volume market like China, I think a lot of growers will look at what it is they're doing, particularly, you know, those under particular water pressure. I think overall agriculture, you know, viticulture will be the same as most forms of agriculture in this country, and it will be about diversification. So moving away from, you know, monoculture, and this is the same, you know, the world over really. We're kind of all just discovering at once that this idea of farming a single crop for a period of time and then, you know, tearing up the land in between doesn't work. It's not sustainable. And now the financial end of it starts to kick in, and it's that idea that you may lose every other season of whatever it is you're growing. That's a pretty big wake up call, I think.
And talking of grape varieties, if you were to pick any grape variety to work with, would it still be, and take regionality out of it, would it be Semillon, and therefore probably you'd have to stay in the Hunter, and Shiraz, or would you look for other grape varieties elsewhere in the world, and perhaps is there a region that sort of you feel?
Well, I'm pretty lucky, right, that I get to work with the two varieties that I love most. It's you know, it's been a kind of lucky path in that way. But more recently, I mean, I've had a great love for Riesling. I worked a season in the Alsace in France in 2002, and that really cemented, you know, my belief in that variety. And again, it was the kind of similar things that grabbed me, you know, as Hunter Valley Semillon, opening up these incredibly old wines with the winemakers and going, oh my God, these are so fresh and vibrant. I just love that unlikelihood of what a wine can do. And so, Riesling. And because we are working in areas like Canberra and Hilltops, which are much cooler than the Hunter, we are increasingly working with Riesling. So I'm indulging that as well.
Yeah, nice. And so, I mean, as a winemaker, vigneron, as the French would put it, you end up having to be grower, perhaps, in some respects, as in, of course, farming a little bit, also winemaker, and in fact, a salesperson, and which for you might be even on the coalface as such, as the Hunter provides such a fantastic place to be running a cellar door and doing retail sales. Which of those do you enjoy the most?
Oh, wow. There you go. I mean, I wish I had time. Like, time's the pressure for everything, right? And I wish I had time to indulge all three.
All three,
I've got to say, though, as the business grows, if you bundle in just running an organization in with the salesman aspect of it, then that's where I'm spending probably 90% of my time, unfortunately. And, you know, people get this very romantic impression of the day-to-day for a winemaker owner, but really I'm at my computer just like you. So that's what's happening. But,
everyone works on a spreadsheet, no matter what you work on. Everyone's stuck on Excel.
Exactly. But look, I love my time in the winery. I love being in the winery alone. It's such a spiritual place. I'm not a religious man, but that's the closest thing I know to a church, basically. The bower room of my winery is that's my church.
Nice. And just finally, before we leave, are you going to be harvesting before 2021 this year? Because I think every time I chat to winemakers in the Hunter, they're like, we're going to be harvesting in December. What, this year? No, probably not.
Mate, they just like the drama. I'm kind of one of those people. I'm not coming back from the beach until after January 4, which happens to be my birthday. I don't work before my birthday, you know. So
It's
I don't
Monday
care what
this
the
year, so
climate's doing.
perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Let the grapes hang, I say. But no, I think the weather, like looking out the window now, even if we're in a hot spell, I think that it's been that much cooler. Well, it actually hasn't been cool. It's interesting, but certainly wetter. I think it'll slow us down a little. There is chat. I mean, our big pressure this year is a lack of international labour. You know, Australians we're a pretty lazy bunch when it comes to manual work. So we really rely on the rest of the world kind of sending their.
Well, especially when the rates that you pay for manual labour as well is pretty astounding. I would say it's. I'll come over.
Yeah. But well, I mean, I think that too. I can't hire anyone at the moment. You know, there's too much government support out there. I can't put someone into a job. You know, it's crazy. So there's going to be harvesting pressure. I think the machine harvesters will be going whenever they can. International, quite seriously though, we found it really hard to hire our vintage crew because there's usually so many international. You know what it's like. You do the northern, southern hemispheres, and because the borders are closed, there's no one here. So we're kind of scratching the barrel. But
no working holiday visas this year.
Exactly. But no, I think we'll be into it probably second week of January. There'll be some fruit coming in.
Nice. Brilliant. Matt, thank you so much for chatting. It's been a pleasure. It's we must get you over in the UK at some point in the near future. Perhaps 2021 will be that year.
I think so, mate. I think so. All righty.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, mate. Speak soon.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me. Bye.